Thank you for clicking in this video. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Stick around to unravel the mysteries and face the fear that hides in plain sight.
Sarah had never felt more at home in her life, or so she thought. The house was perfect, a charming, two-story Victorian on the edge of a quiet town. It had stood empty for years, but to Sarah, it felt like a blank canvas awaiting her personal touch. She had recently moved after a difficult divorce, seeking a fresh start and a sanctuary away from the memories that haunted her. The first few days were spent unpacking and arranging furniture, turning the house into a reflection of her new, independent self. Every room held a sense of peace, each wall whispering promises of new beginnings. But on the third night, as she settled into bed, Sarah felt something peculiar. A soft, warm breeze brushed against her shoulder. Startled, she sat up quickly, glancing around the dimly lit bedroom. The window was closed, and there was no draft. Frowning, she dismissed the sensation as her imagination, or perhaps a lingering draft from earlier in the day. The next morning, the feeling was still fresh in her mind, but she pushed it aside. There was too much to do to let her thoughts linger on something so trivial. She spent the day working, busying herself with the tasks of home ownership. Yet, no matter where she went in the house, the sensation returned. Sometimes in the kitchen as she prepared dinner, other times as she read in the living room. Always the same, a gentle puff of warm air, like a breath, faintly grazing her shoulder. Days passed, and the pattern continued. It was never harsh or painful, never aggressive, but it was there. Always. Like someone was standing just behind her, close enough to feel their breath, but invisible to her eyes. Sarah began to grow anxious, doubting her sanity. She checked the heating system, closed off every window and door, but nothing could explain the odd, consistent sensation. As night fell again, Sarah tried to ignore the whisper of warmth that touched her shoulder. But this time, it stayed longer than usual. Panic crept in as she tried to rationalize it. "It's just your mind playing tricks," she whispered to herself in the dark. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself, the feeling persisted. Restless, she turned to face the other side of the bed, pulling the covers tightly around her. In the silence of the night, she heard it, a faint, almost inaudible sigh, as if someone was exhaling right next to her ear. Her heart pounded in her chest, and a chill ran down her spine, despite the warmth on her shoulder. Sarah lay frozen, listening. There was no one in the room but her, she was sure of it. Yet the breath, it felt so real. Gathering her courage, she slowly turned her head to look over her shoulder. The room appeared empty, but she could sense it, that presence, that invisible someone, watching her. The next morning, she woke exhausted, haunted by the phantom breath that seemed to follow her even into her dreams. She decided to call a friend, unsure of what else to do. Maybe talking it out would help her process what was happening, or at least provide a distraction from the eerie sensations. But as Sarah dialed the number, the phone slipped from her hand. The soft puff of air returned, not just on her shoulder this time, but on the back of her neck, warmer, closer. Her breath hitched in her throat as her body tensed. Something was trying to reach her. Something was waiting for her to understand. The following days grew more unsettling for Sarah. The sensation of being watched, the warm breath on her skin, was no longer just an occasional disturbance, it was constant. Whether she was cleaning the kitchen, sitting in the living room, or standing in front of the bathroom mirror, the feeling never left her. Each time she turned, expecting to catch a glimpse of someone or something, she found only empty space. She began to avoid certain rooms. The bedroom, where the first breath had touched her shoulder, now filled her with dread. The kitchen, once a comforting place where she could lose herself in the simple tasks of cooking, became a place of anxiety. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond her vision, just behind her. One night, as she sat in the living room trying to distract herself with television, the feeling returned, stronger this time. A slow, deliberate exhale against her skin, as if someone were right there, hovering behind her. Her breath quickened, and she froze, the remote slipping from her fingers. The hairs on her arms stood up, and the room seemed to grow darker, colder. Sarah forced herself to move, slowly turning her head toward the empty space behind her. Nothing. But she couldn't shake the sense that something was there. Her pulse raced as she stood up and turned off the television. Every nerve in her body was on edge as she slowly backed out of the room, her eyes darting around, searching for a glimpse of whatever was haunting her. That night, sleep was impossible. She tossed and turned, the whisper of breath haunting her even with her eyes tightly shut. She thought she heard faint footsteps, barely audible, like someone tiptoeing down the hall. Every creak of the old house sent her heart racing. By morning, she was exhausted, dark circles framing her eyes. She avoided looking at herself in the mirror, too tired to face her own reflection. She needed answers. This couldn't go on. Sarah considered calling a priest or a psychic, someone who could cleanse the house or explain the strange occurrences. But the rational part of her mind refused to believe in ghosts or spirits. She was just stressed, wasn't she? Determined to confront whatever was happening, Sarah decided to thoroughly investigate the house. She started with the basement, the one place she rarely ventured. It was dark and musty, filled with boxes left by the previous owners. She rummaged through the piles, dust rising in the air, her flashlight beam revealing old furniture and forgotten trinkets. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the uneasy feeling persisted. She moved to the attic next, its narrow stairs creaking under her weight. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the smell of dust filled her nose. But again, nothing stood out. Just an empty space filled with forgotten things. But as she turned to leave, a sudden gust of air brushed against her neck, warmer, closer than ever before. Sarah gasped, her heart thudding in her chest. She whirled around, shining the flashlight into every corner, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was alone. And yet, she felt it, something was here with her. She hurried downstairs, her heart still pounding. Something was wrong with this house. The whispers, the breath, the constant sensation of being watched, it wasn't just in her head. Something was trying to reach her. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it again. The faintest sigh, like someone letting out a breath right next to her ear. Her body froze in place. This time, she didn't dare turn around. She knew there would be nothing to see. But there was no escaping the truth. She wasn't alone in this house. The next morning, as she prepared breakfast, she felt a sudden pull toward the floor of the kitchen. Her eyes were drawn to the corner of the room, where the wooden planks didn't quite align. Kneeling down, she ran her fingers along the uneven boards, her heart racing with anticipation. With trembling hands, she pried one of the planks loose, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered box. Sarah's breath hitched as she reached for it, her fingers shaking. What was this? Why had it been hidden? The warm breath on her shoulder returned, but this time, it didn't frighten her. It felt different, as if whatever had been following her was waiting for her to find this. To understand. She carefully lifted the box out of the floor and placed it on the kitchen table. Dust flew into the air as she opened the lid, revealing faded photographs, old documents, and something else, a small, yellowed letter. Sarah's fingers trembled as she unfolded the yellowed letter, the paper fragile with age. The handwriting was neat, almost childlike, and the ink had faded with time. She began to read, her eyes scanning the first few words. It was a letter from parents to their child, their words thick with sorrow. To our dearest Emily. We are so sorry, sweet girl. We never got the chance to say goodbye. We hope you understand why we had to leave you here, why we had to hide you away. We did it for your own good, to keep you safe, but it seems we were wrong. Forgive us. May you rest in peace now, my love. The letter was short, but each word carried the weight of a tragedy untold. Sarah's heart sank as she tried to piece together the meaning behind the letter. Emily, the girl mentioned, who was she? And why had her parents hidden her in the house? Questions swirled in Sarah's mind, but before she could delve deeper, her attention was drawn to the photographs inside the box. There, in black and white, was the image of a small girl standing in the very kitchen where Sarah now stood. Her dark hair fell in loose curls around her face, her eyes wide with a mixture of innocence and sadness. In another photo, the same girl stood with her parents, but there was something unsettling in their smiles, strained, as if concealing a darker truth. As Sarah studied the photos, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder. A gust of warm breath brushed her cheek again, but this time it felt more urgent, more insistent. The feeling sent a shiver down her spine, and her gaze shot up, searching the room for any sign of movement. For the first time, she felt compelled to speak aloud. Emily, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Are you here? The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. But then, just as Sarah began to doubt herself, she heard it, the faintest sound, like a soft giggle echoing from somewhere nearby. Her heart raced as she stood up from the table, her eyes darting around the kitchen. The house felt alive, like it was breathing with her. Suddenly, a door creaked open. Sarah whipped around, her heart hammering in her chest. It was the door leading down to the basement. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the staircase, each step creaking beneath her feet. The air grew colder the further she descended, the light dimming as if being swallowed by shadows. Her breath caught in her throat as she reached the bottom, her eyes straining to see in the dim light. There, in the far corner of the basement, she saw it. The faint outline of a figure, a small girl, standing still, her form barely visible in the darkness. Sarah's breath hitched, her body frozen in place. The girl's features were obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the sense of presence. Emily? Sarah called again, her voice trembling. Is that you? The figure didn't move, didn't respond. But Sarah could feel the girl's eyes on her, watching her closely. The room seemed to grow colder with each passing second, the air thickening with an unseen tension. Sarah took a tentative step forward, her mind screaming at her to stop, to turn back and run. But something kept her rooted in place. The need for answers, the pull of the mystery, she couldn't leave now. Just as she reached the middle of the basement, the figure flickered, disappearing into the shadows. A gust of wind rushed past Sarah, chilling her to the bone, and she stumbled back in fear. The basement was empty once again, but the feeling of being watched remained. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, breaking the silence. Sarah gasped, her heart pounding in her ears. She sprinted up the stairs, her mind racing with thoughts of what could have caused the noise. The moment she reached the top, she froze. The kitchen was in disarray. Cabinets that had been neatly closed were now flung wide open, their contents scattered across the floor. Dishes lay broken, utensils clattered in every direction. And there, in the center of the chaos, stood the small, ghostly figure of Emily. But this time, she wasn't a shadowy outline. Sarah could see her clearly, the dark curls, the white dress, her eyes wide with a strange, vacant sadness. The child stared at Sarah, unblinking, as if waiting for her to do something. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah stammered, fear gripping her. "What do you want from me?" Emily didn't speak, but the expression on her face shifted ever so slightly. Her lips parted, and a soft, warm breath escaped her, brushing against Sarah's face. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, Emily vanished. Sarah stood there, trembling, trying to comprehend what she had just witnessed. The room was cold, eerily quiet. It was clear now, Emily's spirit had been trapped here, waiting for someone to find her, to release her from whatever held her captive. But how could Sarah help? What did Emily need? Her mind raced back to the box, to the letter from Emily's parents. They had mentioned hiding her away, a decision made out of love, but one that had led to tragedy. The key had to be there, hidden in the past. Sarah knew she needed to keep searching, to find the missing pieces that could set Emily free. The breath on her shoulder was no longer a mystery, it was a plea. A cry for help from a spirit trapped between worlds. But time was running out, and Sarah feared that if she didn't act soon, Emily's presence would only grow stronger and more dangerous. The house had taken on a new life. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the cracked windows seemed amplified, laced with an unseen presence. Sarah felt the weight of Emily's spirit pressing down on her with every breath she took. Sleep became elusive, her nights filled with the soft whispers of the wind and the unmistakable feeling of that warm breath on her shoulder, ever present, ever watching. Despite her exhaustion, Sarah knew she couldn't stop now. Emily's ghost wasn't just a haunting, it was a child in need, a spirit trapped in an agonizing limbo. And Sarah was the only one who could set her free. The next morning, Sarah made a decision. She would search the house, inch by inch, for any clue that could help her understand what had really happened to Emily. If there was something left behind, something that could explain why Emily's soul was still tethered to this place, Sarah was determined to find it. She started in the attic, a space she had previously avoided due to its eerie, claustrophobic atmosphere. Dust coated every surface, and the beams groaned under the weight of the roof above. Old furniture, covered in sheets, lined the walls, relics from a life long past. Sarah rummaged through the boxes, her hands trembling as she sifted through forgotten belongings. Most of it was junk, old clothes, broken toys, faded photographs. But then, in the farthest corner of the attic, she found something unusual. It was a small wooden chest, unlike anything else in the attic. The chest was locked, but the lock itself was rusted and brittle with age. With a determined tug, Sarah managed to break it open. Inside, wrapped in a delicate silk cloth, was another letter, this one far older than the one she had found in the kitchen, and a small locket. The letter was addressed to Emily, written in the same delicate handwriting as before. But this one carried a different tone, one of urgency and fear. Emily, we tried everything to protect you, but it was not enough. The sickness spread so fast, and we could not save you. We buried your things in the kitchen floor, hoping that it would keep your spirit at peace. But now, we know it was wrong. Forgive us, sweet child. We were only trying to keep you with us, but now we realize we have trapped you. We are so sorry. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she read the final words. The sickness. Emily had died in this house, but her parents, in their grief, had made a terrible mistake. By burying her possessions, they had unknowingly tethered her spirit to the house, trapping her between worlds. It all made sense now. The breath on her shoulder, the giggles in the night. It was Emily, desperately trying to communicate, to make Sarah understand. The child hadn't been malicious. She had simply been reaching out, trying to escape the prison her parents had unknowingly created. Sarah closed her eyes, her heart heavy with the weight of this revelation. She had to do something. She had to free Emily's spirit. But how? The answer, she realized, was in the kitchen. The letter had mentioned burying Emily's things there, hoping it would bring her peace. But instead, it had bound her spirit to the very objects meant to honor her. With renewed purpose, Sarah hurried downstairs to the kitchen. She grabbed a crowbar from the tool shed and began prying up the floorboards, her heart pounding with every strike. Dust and splinters flew as she worked, her hands aching from the effort, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. After what felt like hours, she finally uncovered a small, dusty box beneath the floor. It was much like the chest in the attic, old, worn, and locked with a brittle padlock. Sarah wasted no time breaking it open, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were the remnants of a life lost too soon. A small, tattered dress. A faded doll with glass eyes that seemed to stare back at her. And at the bottom of the box, a photograph, Emily, standing with her parents, smiling shyly at the camera. They looked like a happy family, but now Sarah knew the truth. Their happiness had been shattered by the sickness, and in their grief, they had made a terrible mistake. But there was one more item in the box, a small bundle of papers, tied with a red ribbon. Sarah carefully untied it, revealing another letter. This one wasn't from the parents. It was from Emily herself, written in the shaky handwriting of a child. "Mommy, Daddy, why can't I come with you? Why are you leaving me here? I'm scared, and I don't like the dark. I want to go home with you. Please don't leave me here." The letter trailed off, unfinished. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she imagined the fear and confusion Emily must have felt in her final moments. She had been left behind, alone in the dark, and her spirit had been trapped in this house ever since. As Sarah placed the items back in the box, a sudden chill swept through the room. She looked up, and there, standing at the edge of the kitchen, was Emily. But this time, her ghostly form wasn't shrouded in darkness. She stood in the soft morning light, her features clear and sharp. Emily's eyes met Sarah's, and for the first time, there was no fear, no sadness. Only gratitude. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice soft, barely more than a breath. "I can go home now." With that, the child's figure began to fade, dissolving into the air like mist. The room grew warmer, the oppressive weight lifting as Emily's spirit finally found peace. Sarah stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where Emily had disappeared. The house was silent now, but it no longer felt cold or empty. It felt at peace. She had done it. She had freed Emily. But as Sarah closed the box and replaced the floorboards, a thought nagged at the back of her mind. If Emily had been trapped here all this time, what other secrets did this house hold? What other spirits might still be lingering, waiting for someone to set them free? As the sun set on the house, casting long shadows across the walls, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her work here wasn't finished. Not yet. The sense of peace Sarah felt after Emily's departure was fleeting. For a brief moment, the house had felt lighter, as if the air itself had been cleansed of the dark presence that had lingered for so long. But soon, the silence grew heavy again, oppressive in a different way. The house wasn't done with her, and Sarah could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Her nights were still restless. Despite Emily's spirit finding peace, Sarah couldn't shake the sensation that she wasn't alone. The whisper of a breath no longer came to her shoulder, but she felt a watchful presence in every corner, as though the walls themselves were breathing, pulsating with life. Determined to understand, Sarah began to dig deeper into the history of the house. The archives at the local library became her second home. She pored over old documents, newspaper clippings, and town records, desperate to unearth anything that could explain the lingering dread in the house. The more she uncovered, the more disturbed she became. The house had a long, tragic history. Before Emily's family had moved in, it had been the scene of multiple unexplained disappearances. Families had come and gone, leaving suddenly and without explanation. There were whispers in the old town papers of strange occurrences, ghostly sightings, and a pervasive evil that seemed to cling to the very foundation of the building. Emily's tragic death had only been the latest chapter in a much older, darker story. But there was something else. Buried deep in the town's records, Sarah found a mention of a fire. A devastating fire had ravaged the original structure over 100 years ago, killing several people trapped inside. The bodies had never been recovered, their spirits said to be trapped within the ruins. The house had been rebuilt, but the legend remained, a cursed place where the dead roamed free. It wasn't just Emily. That night, as Sarah sat in her living room, the air thick with the weight of her newfound knowledge, she felt it again. The cold. But this time, it wasn't a soft breath on her shoulder. It was a presence, looming, watching from the darkened corners of the room. Sarah stood up, her heart racing as she scanned the room. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. But she knew. She could feel the eyes on her, invisible, yet undeniable. Whatever had haunted Emily's family, and the families before them, was still here, and it had no intention of leaving. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her flashlight and headed to the basement. She had avoided this part of the house since moving in. The dark, musty space filled her with a nameless dread. But something told her that the key to understanding this malevolent force lay in the depths of the house's foundation. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her feet as she descended into the cold, damp air of the basement. The smell of mold and earth hit her like a wave, but she pressed on, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick darkness. The walls down here were different, older. Exposed brick crumbled in places, revealing layers of stone that felt ancient. At the far end of the basement, Sarah noticed something strange. There was a section of the wall that seemed out of place, too smooth, too clean compared to the rest of the rough, aged stone. She moved closer, her heart hammering in her chest. It was a door. A small, iron door, half hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates. She hadn't seen it before, and there was no mention of it in the house's blueprints. The door had no handle, just a rusted keyhole, as though it hadn't been opened in years, maybe decades. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached out to touch the cold iron. Just as her hand brushed the surface, a low moan echoed through the basement. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound wasn't human, it was a deep, guttural wail that seemed to come from the very walls around her. Suddenly, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow passage that led deeper into the earth. A rush of cold air poured out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of decay. Whatever lay beyond that door, Sarah knew it was something ancient, something far older than Emily's tragedy. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But her body moved forward, driven by a force she didn't fully understand. The passage was long and winding, the air growing colder and more suffocating the deeper she went. The walls seemed to close in around her, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But she kept moving, her flashlight flickering as she reached the end of the tunnel. And then, she saw it. A small, circular room lay at the end of the passage, its walls lined with what looked like crude carvings, symbols that Sarah didn't recognize but that filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and atop the altar sat a box, similar to the one she had found in the kitchen, but much older, more sinister. Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding in her ears. Whatever was in that box, she knew it was the source of the darkness that had plagued this house for so long. But as much as she wanted to run, she couldn't. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. With shaking hands, Sarah approached the altar. The air grew colder with each step, the oppressive presence in the room pressing down on her with a suffocating weight. Her fingers hovered over the box's lid, hesitant to touch it, but driven by a force she couldn't explain. When she finally lifted the lid, the room seemed to shudder, as if the very walls were reacting to what had been released. Inside the box was a single object, a small, weathered doll, its face cracked and worn, but its eyes seemed to stare straight into her soul. A sudden gust of wind blew through the passage behind her, extinguishing her flashlight. The room plunged into darkness, and in the blackness, Sarah heard it. A voice. Faint, whispering, but unmistakably real. "Why did you open it?" the voice asked, its tone chilling and accusatory. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned, but saw nothing. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything around her. Then, she felt it again. The breath on her shoulder. Sarah's mind raced as the cold breath lingered on her shoulder, sending chills down her spine. She couldn't see anything in the pitch-black room, but the oppressive weight of the air told her she wasn't alone. The voice had been real. There was something with her, something ancient and full of malice. Her chest tightened as panic threatened to take hold. She fumbled for her flashlight, desperate to bring back some sense of control, but her hand shook so violently that it slipped from her grasp and clattered to the ground. The darkness pressed in, suffocating, as the whisper echoed again, this time closer. "Why did you open it?" The question gnawed at her, but her survival instincts kicked in. She had to get out of there. Grasping blindly in the dark, her fingers brushed the cold stone walls, and she stumbled back toward the passageway. Every step felt like a struggle against an unseen force, as though the house itself was trying to pull her back into its depths. The narrow tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly in the dark, but finally, Sarah saw a faint glow of light from the basement ahead. She burst through the iron door and slammed it shut behind her, gasping for air as the sound of the latch echoed in the now eerily silent basement. She backed away from the door, her breath coming in ragged bursts, trying to collect herself. But deep down, she knew that whatever she had unleashed wasn't confined to that room. It was free now, and it was with her. As she climbed back up the stairs into the main house, Sarah's mind raced with questions. What had she just uncovered? The doll in the box had been so unsettling, its cracked face and lifeless eyes now burned into her memory. But it was more than just an object. She had felt its presence, like it was watching her, judging her for disturbing its rest. And that voice, it had sounded so close, so real. Back in the living room, she collapsed onto the couch, her body trembling with adrenaline and fear. She grabbed her phone and dialed Emily's parents, the only other people she thought might have answers. The call rang once, twice, before it went straight to voicemail. She left a shaky message, asking for any information they might have about the house's history, but deep down, Sarah wasn't sure they could help. She had crossed into something much older, much darker than anyone could have anticipated. That night, sleep eluded her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the old house making her jump. The cold breath on her shoulder didn't return, but she could feel the house watching her, waiting. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, anticipating something terrible to come. At 3 a.m., the temperature in the room plummeted. Sarah's breath fogged in the air as the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with an unseen presence, but this time it wasn't Emily. It was something darker. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate, growing closer. Sarah bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. Her bedroom door creaked open, but no one appeared. The house seemed to groan in response, the air thick with tension. Suddenly, the doll, still lying on the altar deep in the basement, flashed in her mind. The carvings, the strange symbols. It wasn't just a relic, it was a beacon for something. She had disturbed an ancient force, and now it had taken notice of her. The house wasn't haunted by a restless child's spirit anymore. It was possessed by something far more sinister. By dawn, Sarah had made up her mind. She had to leave. Whatever had been unleashed in the house was beyond her control, and staying any longer felt like tempting fate. She packed quickly, throwing clothes and essentials into a suitcase with shaking hands. But as she moved through the house, she could feel the eyes on her again. The oppressive presence seemed to follow her from room to room, like a predator stalking its prey. The moment she reached the front door, something stopped her cold. A voice, no, several voices, whispered in unison, "You can't leave." She froze, her hand on the doorknob. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, surrounding her on all sides. The house groaned, as if it were alive, the wood creaking under an unseen pressure. Suddenly, a rush of cold air hit her, and the door slammed shut on its own. Sarah stumbled back, panic rising in her chest. The house wasn't letting her go. Desperate, she ran toward the kitchen. There had to be a way out, a window, a back door, anything. But when she reached the kitchen, her eyes fell on the floorboards. The loose board where she had found Emily's box of memories. A thought occurred to her, one that made her blood run cold, the box. It had something to do with all of this. If she could find the second box, the one with the doll, maybe she could end whatever curse had been placed on this house. She rushed down to the basement, her heart racing. The iron door was still closed, but now it seemed to throb with an almost organic life, pulsing in the dim light. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the door and stepped back into the narrow tunnel. The room with the altar awaited her, but this time, the air was thicker, the cold more biting. The doll still sat atop the stone slab, its cracked face staring up at her with a malice that seemed far beyond an inanimate object. But there was something else on the altar now, an old, yellowed letter, its edges frayed with age. She hadn't seen it before. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the altar and picked up the letter. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The letter was addressed to Emily. Her parents had written it, apologizing for their inability to save her, for failing to protect her from the house's curse. They had hoped that burying her memories in that box would keep her spirit at rest, but it had only trapped her, and something else, with her. The house had never belonged to the living. It had always been a prison for the dead. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized the full weight of what she had uncovered. The doll wasn't just a relic. It was the source of the curse, a totem of the spirits bound to this place. And now, it had bound her, too. The air around her grew colder still, and she felt the breath on her shoulder once more, cold, sharp, and full of anger. But this time, when she turned, she saw it. A shadow, taller than any human, its face featureless, loomed in the doorway. The figure radiated an aura of pure malevolence, and the cold breath came from its very presence. It had been watching her all along, waiting for her to open the door, to break the seal. Sarah's body seized in terror, but she couldn't move. The doll's cracked face seemed to smile now, twisted and malevolent. The shadow took a step closer, its cold breath filling the room. In a final, desperate act, Sarah grabbed the doll and hurled it against the wall. The ancient porcelain shattered, and with it, the oppressive air seemed to shudder. The shadow let out a deafening screech, as if it had been struck. The walls trembled, the entire house shaking as the dark presence recoiled. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The air grew still, the coldness lifted, and the oppressive weight of the house was gone. The shadow had vanished. Sarah collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. It was over. The house, finally, had let her go. But as she stood to leave, a final whisper echoed in her ear, soft, gentle, but unmistakable. "Thank you." Emily's voice.
If you want to watch another story, there is another video appearing on your screen now. Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more spine-chilling stories.